to have all of you on here. I'm joined today by Allison Meyer from our Denver partnership, and she's going to really help us walk through our Restorative Justice Implementation Guide that was just released last week. So before we get started, because all of you have been in Circle, and hopefully all of you have been trained in Circle, I know we do have some folks who are joining who haven't gone through one of the trainings. We're actually going to start this off with an opening. So Allison's going to read us an opening to kick things off.
This is Marilyn Taylor's poem, Subject to Change, a reflection on my students. They are so beautiful and so very young. They seem almost to glitter with perfection, these creatures that I briefly move among. I never get to stay with them for long, but even so, I view them with affection. They are so beautiful and so very young. Poised or clumsy, placid or high-strung, they're expert in the art of introspection, these creatures that I briefly move among. And if their words don't quite trip off the tongue consistently with just the right inflection, they remain beautiful and very young. Still, I have to tell myself it's wrong to think of them as anything but fiction, these creatures that I briefly move among. Because like me, they're traveling headlong in that familiar vertical direction that coarsens beautiful and blackmails young, those two delusions we all move among.
Thanks, Allison. All right, everyone. So before we get started with the implementation guide, I just want to briefly talk about the partnership. And so this is a partnership that we have with some organizations in Denver, Colorado that really seeks to provide resources for not only schools in Denver and throughout the state of Colorado, but also nationally. And so as all of you know, I work at Advancement Project. We are a civil rights, racial justice organization that works on one of the issues that we focus on is dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline. And we do that work alongside community organizations that are seeking to transform school discipline policies and practices and build power at the local level. And we know that these policies and practices push young people, especially Black students, brown students, LGBTQ, and special needs students out of school and on a pathway to prison. And so Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, where Allison works, is one of our longtime community partners. We've been working with them since about 2003. And so we've seen a lot of change throughout the country in recent years, where school communities were moving away from zero tolerance policies and looking towards ways to create more positive learning environments for young people. And while we were seeing change at the local level, there wasn't a lot of change nationally. So we started working on building relationships with national education stakeholders, and that's really where our work with NEA took off. So a lot of you who came to the NEA training, it really started because we were trying to be intentional about sharing the stories that we were seeing across the country at the national level so we could create systemic change. And so it was around that time that teachers' unions started to acknowledge the harms of zero tolerance policies and where our work with NEA deepened. And as we traveled across the country talking to educators about the school-to-prison pipeline, we started to get questions about restorative justice. What was it, and how could it be implemented in the school setting? Meanwhile, at the local level in Denver, Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, the Denver Classroom Teachers Association, which is the local union, Denver Public Schools, and the University of Denver were working and engaged in regular conversations about building upon and improving and evaluating some of the changes the school district had made throughout the years, including the use of restorative justice. There was a deep commitment there at the local level to do this work, even without outside support. But what we realized nationally was that Denver held the answers to many of the questions we were getting from not only educators, but also community members and students and families as well. And that really led us to the creation of this much broader partnership that was inclusive of every representative of the school community. And this is rare because we really don't see unions, community members, and school districts working together that often. And so during our initial meetings a couple years ago, we really thought through how we could address some of the needs both at the local level, but also use Denver as a model that other school communities could look to for guidance. And so we developed a list of initiatives and resources that we've carried out over the last 2 years, with this implementation guide being the latest resource. And you received one of the other resources that we developed last year, and then also later on, Allison will be talking about some of the other opportunities that exist for folks nationally to come and observe some of the work that is happening in Denver. And so we didn't want just a resource for educators. We wanted something that everyone could use, so both schools, school district staff, and students and families. And we wanted to be able to share, that resource with folks throughout the country, many folks who had already started to ask us about how they begin implementation in their school communities to ensure that the practices that we know improve school culture and climate were being implemented with fidelity. We know a lot of school districts are really struggling with how to implement restorative justice the right way, and so we really hope this guide could be a useful resource for that work.
Great, thanks, Duana. So just a little bit more about myself. My name is Allison Meyer, and I'm the project manager for the Denver School-Based Restorative Practices Partnership. And some background about myself, I have been trained by Aura and Cheryl this past May in Chicago. And I also am a former classroom teacher. I taught for 6 years in Chicago and then 1 year in Denver before entering into this new realm of work. So one of the driving values of this partnership has always been honesty, and we try to be very honest about the work that people are setting out to start doing, and that there are challenges to it. So we just want to make sure that school communities understand the realities of what goes into dismantling these traditional school discipline policies and the power structures that exist in our education system. And so in light of that honesty, I feel like I should also mention that a partnership such as this is not one that comes without challenges. When you bring unions and districts and community organizations into the same space, there's inevitably going to be areas of tension. And I think one of the most remarkable measures of the success that we've seen in Denver is that we've worked through those tensions. To me, that's incredibly reflective of the hard work that happens in a school to sustain the relationship between staff and students and families. So I actually was going to share an example from this week, actually. When rumors around the repeal of DACA started becoming a reality last Thursday, Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, the grassroots community organization, began working with a coalition of immigrant rights organizations across Denver to support and promote student walkouts. Out of respect for the partnership that we've built and being understanding of the safety concerns that go along with walkouts, Padres reached out to the superintendent's office to let them know that the walkouts were in development. Padres also contacted the principal of one of the schools that serves as a demonstration site for our work. And the principal and Padres, while in complete agreement politically and both caring deeply about the impact of the repeal of DACA on Denver young people and their families, were definitely not on the same page as far as strategy goes with these walkouts. And so the DACA repeal came on Tuesday. A significant group of students in Denver walked out, and some trust between two of our partners was threatened. And so just yesterday, Padres met with that principal to have what essentially was a restorative conversation, and each partner shared what had happened, what they were thinking at the time, and how to better support one another and communicate with one another in the future. Well, I was freaking out a little bit back at our office. They were both doubling down on their commitment to the work of this partnership and pledging not to let differences in other areas of work impact our ultimate goal, which is to spread restorative justice to more schools and districts nationwide. And so I wanted to share this because I think this is just one example of how much effort goes into sustaining a partnership like this one. We've seen teacher bargaining impact our work. We've seen newly passed district policies test the strength of our partnership. Some of the schools that we worked with have had changes in administration or teacher turnover, and yet we're still here. And we're constantly reminding ourselves and each other that all we want is what is best for our students and best for our educators and best for our students' families. So I'd like to think each time we overcome one of these hurdles, our partnership becomes a little less fragile. As Duana mentioned, these are the 5 organizations that sit at our partnership leadership team, but I would also be remiss to not mention the Colorado Education Association, which is our state affiliate. When NEA issued its policy statement on institutional racism, it lit a spark at the CEA office in Denver, and ending institutional racism became the driving goal of their strategic plan for the next 2 years. And so in the last year, they've helped our partnership secure funding through NEA's Great Public Schools Fund and the Office of Community Advocacy and Partner Engagement. CEA is hosting regional summits across the state of Colorado to ensure our work is being shared, and it's really been great to have their support. So if there's anyone from Colorado on the call or our neighboring states, feel free to reach out about where those summits will be in the coming months. And for those of you a little farther away, CEA has been a great model for how a statewide union might support this work, and I'd be happy to discuss that in more detail if that interests you. We are also fortunate to have 3 schools that serve as demonstration sites for what restorative practices look like in its various stages when implemented school-wide. These 3 schools are North High School, Skinner Middle School, and Hallett Academy, and they are by no means perfect, but they have explored what it means to be restorative for the last 6 to 11 years and have certainly overcome some hurdles in order to sustain restorative practices as the driving philosophy in their buildings. And I know there's always language difference too in the language that different areas use. Denver is very strong on restorative practices, so I will be using that terminology today. So now that you have a better understanding of what it's taken to get the stakeholders sitting together at the table, I wanted to talk a little bit about the guide that we've created. So we are calling it School-Wide Restorative Practices Step by Step, and hopefully you all have a copy of it. I'll kind of walk us through how the guide was created, what makes it different from some of the other guides that are out there, and then we will go through kind of like section by section. Don't feel like you have to follow along, but if you are someone who learns better that way, I'll definitely reference page numbers as we go. So when our partnership set out to draft the guide in December of 2015, we had 2 primary objectives. First, we wanted to create a practical guide that supported schools in developing the systems and structures that are necessary to build and sustain restorative culture, especially when they are faced with the common obstacles that we've seen throughout the country. And second, we needed to ensure that this guide reflected the various stakeholders' vision of how successful implementation of RP looks and how it feels. So those of us who have been fortunate enough to be part of a welcoming school community, whether as a student or a family member or an educator, know that they don't happen by chance. It's with intentionality and persistence that buildings like North, Skinner, and Hallett exist and continue to exist despite facing teacher turnover and administrative changes and budget cuts, you name it. So representatives from each of our partners sat down with practitioners and administrators from those 3 schools, and they used lessons learned from a decade of culture shifting to outline the necessary steps to transform school culture from punitive to restorative. This guide was written over the course of about 6 months, through working group meetings and countless cycles of draft review and revisions by each of the partners and of the 3 schools. The initial working group meetings were simple brainstorming sessions with anywhere from 4 to 10 representatives from our partner organizations in the schools. And eventually I started drafting some language, and I would bring it back to the working groups, and we slowly found our voice and developed the guide section by section. So each section of this guide has now been reviewed by community members, district employees, school-based practitioners, union leadership, and principals. Like I mentioned before, one thing all of the partners in the schools had in common was a desire to be honest and transparent about what this takes. We don't want to paint restorative practices as a silver bullet, as a solution that, once it's implemented, it fixes any challenges you have within a school. Instead, we want to make sure that we are supporting educators and community members to use this tool to understand that restorative practices is a mindset that can always be refined and improved upon as the building evolves and faces new conditions. Ultimately, what we've produced is an implementation and advocacy tool that we are incredibly proud of, and we have been itching to get it into the hands of educators and community members across the country. By involving so many perspectives throughout its development, we've created a guide that values every stakeholder in a school community. It manages to emphasize student and family ownership of school culture in a way that we feel is often forgotten. We've included what tools, supports, and training our educators need to successfully carry out this vision. And we deliberately speak to what implementation looks like through a race-conscious lens because, as Swana mentioned, it's the school-to-prison pipeline and the racial disparities that persist in the disciplining of young people that have been driving this work. As for the structure of the guide itself, unique from some of the other guides in circulation, School-Wide Restorative Practices Step by Step does not aim to teach the practices themselves, like how to facilitate a restorative mediation or how to keep circle in your classroom. Those resources exist and there's no need for us to recreate them. Rather, our guide supports schools in developing the larger systems and structures that are needed to make restorative practices sustainable at a building or even a district level. Throughout the guide, users are walked through a timeline to reach what we have determined as the 7 benchmarks of school-wide implementation. There are additional resources on how to divide roles and responsibilities among staff, how to collect and analyze data in a way that will prove successes and identify challenges and inform next steps, how to reach out to external partners that your school doesn't have to do this work alone, and what to do when it feels like restorative practices just aren't working. This guide isn't just made for school administrators, like Dwana said, or for district employees. We've created this guide as a tool for individual teachers who know that their school is disproportionately disciplining students of color and want to do something about it. We've created this guide for students who feel unsafe in the hallways of their school and want to advocate for something better. This guide should be used by families who are looking to be more involved in their son or daughter's school but don't know what role they can play. Any member of the school community can and should use this tool as a means to create a building where students want to learn and where educators want to work and where families feel welcome. So I believe everybody on the call has a copy of the guide, and like I said, you can feel free to kind of reference as you go, but it's totally not necessary, especially if you're on the phone. So if for any reason you didn't get a copy and you want one right now, you could probably hop on our website real quickly at www.denverrp.org. So if you turn to the introduction on page 2 of the guide, you will not only find the frame for restorative practices as a tool for equity that Dwana provided for us earlier, but also a bit of the history of restorative practices in Denver. So some of the language that we've been using, in Denver is we call our model a homegrown model. It came from community pressure. So parents and youth organized in Denver under the guidance of Padres y Jóvenes Unidos and forced the school district to reform its discipline policy and also to start moving towards restorative practices. So the original pilot program in Denver was actually from a grant from the Colorado Department of Education, and it was actually the community organization that had fundraised the money to hire a grant writer to write the grant, which eventually guaranteed Denver Public Schools $1 million in pilot funding. That money went to hire restorative justice coordinators at one Denver high school and its 3 feeder middle schools, and expanded the following year to another Denver high school and 3 more feeder middle schools. I would say the city of Denver and Denver Public Schools certainly learned a lot through this process. Some successes that came from this was the reform to the district discipline policy. If you look at Denver Public Schools discipline policy, the only named intervention is restorative practices. There's been statewide discipline reform in Colorado. And then there were also some clear challenges that came out of this pilot program. Many of those initial pilot schools, of those 8, are still struggling to sustain restorative practices today. And some of them, in all honesty, haven't had restorative practices since the grant funding ran out some 6 years ago. And I would say one of the biggest lessons that we learned in Denver is that you can't just hire somebody and put them in the building and then expect that work to live in that one person in their one office and have it take hold throughout a building. So RP implementation in Denver is still fairly inconsistent. We have schools that have incredibly advanced implementation. They use students and volunteers in creative ways to lead the work. They add a restorative lens to everything that they do, whether developing school policies or the way they onboard staff. We have schools that struggle, that have hired restorative practices coordinators and go through the motions of restorative practices, but don't actually see the culture shift because something's missing in their recipe for success. We also have schools that aren't implementing, or frankly are implementing with such a lack of fidelity that it's almost harmful to what we're trying to do in some of our other schools. And so I'm sure some of that kind of speaks to what you guys might be seeing in the districts that you work in or the school communities that you're a part of. So in a lot of ways, this partnership was an attempt at a second pilot in Denver. As one of our district partners calls it Restorative Practices 2.0, based on the lessons we learned from that original grant about how to actually create sustainable restorative practices. So one of the first things that we needed to determine when we were writing this guide is what does it actually take to make RP stick in some schools where it's not sticking in others. And so if you turn to page 5 of the guide, if you are following along, I wanted to talk a little bit about this section, determining readiness for implementation. So as Dwana mentioned, we've been really lucky to have a research partner for the length of this partnership and even before that. Dr. Yoli Anyan of the University of Denver's Graduate School of Social Work has just been an incredible partner, both for the district individually and then our partnership as a whole. She conducted interviews and focus groups with the school communities of North, Skinner, and Hallett, those 3 demonstration schools, to figure out what it is about these 3 schools that allowed them to continue to prioritize restorative values despite the grant term ending and other inevitable challenges. So she coded the responses and found 4 common elements that point towards success. Those elements were principal vision and commitment, staff buy-in, professional development, and a full-time restorative practices coordinator. Just to kind of talk a little bit more about each of these elements, principal vision and commitment, it's really important, and obviously a lot of us know this, that an administrator is willing to make the time and space for restorative practices to be implemented. I would say when I see schools sometimes at more advanced implementations, the principals may be able to take more of a back seat and doesn't have to take as active of a role. But very early on in the process, we've seen it's really important for the principal to make sure it's clear that this is the way that our school is now going, and this is the culture that we're trying to maintain in our building. Principal commitment is obviously incredibly important, too, for making sure that we're allocating time for teachers to practice these skills and for there to be training, and obviously for money to be allocated to restorative practices as well. Staff buy-in, we understand that there probably is never going to be 100% staff buy-in in a school, but that you should aim to have most of your staff participating in restorative practices, believing in restorative practices, and understanding that restorative practices is necessary, and understanding why it's a better option than traditional punitive practices. At the union, they're always pushing me to say staff ownership instead of staff buy-in, that the staff really needs to be able to own this work because it doesn't work when it just lives in one person in the building. Professional development, we believe that this should be ongoing and intensive. A lot of times we'll see schools that'll just train at the beginning of the year or onboard train teachers, you know, when they first enter the school. But we're talking here about professional development that also includes coaching in a non-evaluative way around restorative practices as teachers are in their classroom. And then finally, our partnership did find that part of the success definitely lied in these 3 schools hiring a full-time restorative practices coordinator. But we are understanding of the fact that that is not financially possible for every school district. I think it is important to point out that in Denver, schools are not necessarily given funding to hire a restorative practices coordinator. They have to decide to hire a restorative practices coordinator out of their building budget, which is why it's something that we pointed out as a recipe for success, is that these 3 schools that we like to highlight as our demonstration sites have continuously chosen to allocate that money to hire a full-time person to do this work. But we have seen schools take creative solutions to that as well. We've seen one school right now in Denver is an elementary school that is running their entire restorative practices work using parent volunteers. They have, I think it's 5 or 6 parent volunteers that rotate throughout the week. And so there's always someone in the building that is holding that work at any time throughout the week. But they've obviously taken a slightly untraditional way of doing that, in a way that can help them use that money in their budget for other needs. One of the resources that Dwana sent out is actually a longer document about this page. So if you see taking restorative practices school-wide in your email, that'll give you a much more comprehensive summary of that research that Dr. Anion did for us. So it was representatives from those same 3 schools that are highlighted in that report that worked with the partners to determine exactly what we mean by school-wide restorative practices. One of our very first working groups was a gathering of stakeholders with incredibly different perspectives, sitting down and spending 2 hours hashing out what does a school need to have in order to claim that they implement RP school-wide. Skinner Middle School, one of the original pilot sites in Denver, had some of the strongest opinions on this topic, having been one of those schools where RP lived in a person in an office for years before they actually got it successfully to spread to the rest of the school. So many of us know what it feels like to walk into an inviting school, but it was that conversation that led to the development of the 7 benchmarks for implementation around which the rest of the guide is structured. And for those of you following along, those benchmarks can be found on page 6 of the guide. I should point out that none of our demonstration sites would say that they meet those benchmarks every day. But since their development, these benchmarks have been a constant point of reference for our schools. When we drafted the benchmarks, the dean at one of the high schools, for example, asked if I could actually send them along to her because she wanted to make sure that her school was actually meeting the benchmarks before they started opening their door to visitors. So our partners and our schools really see this as a constant work in progress. She and her principal actually called the district's restorative practices trainer mid-year when they realized after looking at the benchmarks that they had forgotten to train their new staff that year. So we really see, like I said, our schools use this guide as well. So how does this guide actually support schools in meeting these benchmarks? First, we thought it was incredibly important to identify which people in your building might take up certain pieces of work. Like I mentioned before, our demonstration sites have seen a lot of success in hiring restorative practices coordinators. And in Denver Public Schools, these positions do come out of individual building budgets. So it's a decision that our principals make each year. Do I fund the RP coordinator instead of you name it? More and more, we are seeing schools commit to restorative practices. And out of the 200 schools in DPS, we're hoping to see 100 of them with full-time staff dedicated to RP this school year. Now, those of us with experience in schools know that it is one thing to hire those people and quite another to protect their position from turning into a dumping ground for unrelated administrative tasks. And so one of the most referenced pieces of the guide within my work in Denver Public Schools has been the RP coordinator job description that you'll find on page 8. To the point that the district lead on restorative practices has been working with human resources at DPS to rewrite the RP coordinator job description using this language. What we see a lot is that when a restorative practices coordinator isn't putting out a fire, so working with students that have just gotten in a fight or mediating a conversation between a parent and a teacher, a lot of times the preventative work isn't valued or given the same value as the responsive restorative work. And so we see that these restorative practices coordinators aren't given the time and space that they need to go out and build those proactive relationships with students and staff. And so I use this job description frequently to show, like, this is what a restorative practices coordinator should do. And then in addition, you should be very careful about adding anything else to this job description, just because that would take that person away from being able to do preventative work. In this section, you'll also see that there's some guidance in what role a principal might take in restorative practices implementation, a classroom teacher, or even an implementation team. What follows in the next 3 portions of the guide are step-by-step instructions on how to meet the benchmarks, how to troubleshoot where you might be going wrong, and how to expand restorative practices when you've met the benchmarks. The timeline for implementation, which begins on page 10 of the guide, walks educators and community members through what they should be doing at different times of the year, such as during the summer or in the first month of school, in order to meet each benchmark. A common trend that we've unfortunately seen in Denver is schools thinking they are implementing restorative practices, but upon closer inspection, the punitive culture of the school still persists. Teachers are still requesting suspensions, students expect to be punished, and the sense of community is weak. And so our school-based partners recommended creating an anti-model, which we'll find on page 15, that explains what restorative practices is not. It is broken down by benchmarks that you can look to this anti-model and identify exactly where your building needs to focus its attention and resources. For example, if you see that classroom teachers are continuing to set up rigid consequence ladders as part of their classroom norms, your school most likely has failed to meet benchmark 2, to create a foundational structure that supports RP. I've seen elementary schools, for example, that will have staff use the CLIP system. This is one of my least favorite systems that I often see in schools. It's a system where you will have, a red level, an orange level, a yellow level, and a green level. And every student starts on green. And if a student doesn't follow the expectations for that day, they might be moved to yellow or to orange. I think there is a way to add a restorative lens to this system, but I often see teachers and schools fail to intentionally do that. And so I've seen a teacher, for example, tell a student that they need to clip down from green to yellow. And if the student is escalated on the way over to clip down, they might maybe push a chair. And now the teacher has told that student, I think I need you to also move down to orange right now. And so what we'll see is you have teachers end up using this system that's supposed to be helping to manage classroom behavior, and it's actually escalating students to a point where they get sent out of the classroom. And now as a school, you've actually encouraged your teachers to use a classroom management structure that directly conflicts with the philosophy of restorative practices. So that's just one example of how I've seen schools using more rigid consequence ladders that really, then we try to work with that school on, like, how can we help you meet benchmark 2, where the structures that you're putting in place in your school actually support teachers in using restorative practices rather than make it more difficult for them to use them. We've also wanted schools to support schools to continue to amplify their commitment to being restorative even after the benchmarks have been reached. So if you look at page 17 of the guide, for those of you following along, there are ways that a school might continue to grow in each benchmark after they've been met. For example, if you've already successfully trained all of your new and returning teachers, you might be wondering how you can grow from that. But you can begin training every adult in your building that interacts with youth. So we have schools that train their cafeteria staff and bus drivers in restorative practices so that they can make sure that the language coming from adults is consistent throughout the building. One thing our partnership was sure of is that we needed more than just benchmarks and a timeline of steps to meet them in order for this guide to be successful. So the remaining pieces of this guide are meant to be elements to help with sustainability. How do you make this mindset stick in your building? By far, the most powerful moment of collaboration for me to facilitate was the night we drafted this next section of the guide, which is called Overcoming Common Challenges to Implementation. Around the table were local and national experts in the field, union leaders, school-based practitioners, community organizers, top-level district officials, and school principals. We openly discussed challenges that we frequently observe in schools, most of which our demonstration sites have faced or are currently facing. As a collaborative, we then developed solutions based on the experiences and the resources of the people around the table. Partner organizations that frequently find themselves working in opposition to one another developed ways that they might work with one another in order to support a school in overcoming obstacles and transforming schools into places that students and families and educators want to be. One that sticks out to me is on page 21, the common challenge of losing funding. This really hit home for our schools, especially since 2 of our 3 demonstration sites had been part of that initial grant, and after 5 years lost the funding for their restorative practices coordinators. So we had a long conversation that night about what those schools did to make sure that they continued to prioritize hiring a person to carry this work in their building. Just as an example, Skinner Middle School had really frank conversations with their restorative practices coordinator about those budget concerns, and their RP coordinator for the year after grant funding took a significant pay cut with the understanding that the school would take 6 months to figure out how to be able to actually restore that person's pay. And so all these solutions that we worked into the guide really come from the experiences of our different partner organizations and our schools. Another one that I'd like to point out is on page 25. We mentioned the fact that sometimes we see that disparities in discipline do not change, even though there are overall changes in the number of suspensions and expulsions. This is something that Denver Public Schools is currently experiencing. Since they've started implementing restorative practices, they have seen dramatic decreases in suspensions and expulsions and the use of police in schools. But they do continue to see racial disparities, and the gap has barely changed in their data. And so these solutions that we provided on page 25 under disparities in discipline do not change are solutions that our district is actively using right now to address the fact that they're not seeing those developments. Our partnership clearly values multi-stakeholder collaboration, and the section beginning on page 26 speaks directly to this value. Restorative practices came to Denver Public Schools after pressure from the community, and so from its beginning, there have been multiple stakeholders at the table pushing for this reform. I wanted to give some examples of collaboration from Denver that expanded our partnership beyond the 5 partner organizations. If you look at page 28, you'll see that our partnership suggests partnering with law enforcement and the courts. Early on in Denver's transition, even just having friendly judges made a huge impact in reducing the school-to-prison pipeline. And so we would have judges who, when they would get cases in front of them that they felt should have been handled by schools, they would just refuse to hear the case. In addition, there's an intergovernmental agreement in Denver between Denver Public Schools and the Denver Police Department. And the Denver Police Department, as part of that agreement, says that they will not be involved in issues that they think can be handled in schools. And so that tool has been incredibly useful in limiting the use of police on campuses. On page 29, you'll also see that we recommend reaching out to local universities. Like I said, Dr. Yoli Anion has been incredibly useful for us. And she's even led research projects that included like 6 or 7 of her Master School of Social Work students, where they've gone into some of our schools and conducted observations to figure out the level of implementation. In addition to what we list on that page, we've also seen a lot of benefit from some of our schools have recently started using MSW interns as additional mental health supports. So Skinner Middle School, which you use as one of our demonstration sites, currently has one social worker, and he typically takes on anywhere from, I've seen him take 3 to 5 social work interns in a given year to expand the school's capacity to provide mental health supports for students. In the next section of the guide, you'll see is data analysis. When we reviewed the data analysis section of this guide as our large partner group, it was certainly a catalyst for a larger conversation between the district and the principals about how their current reporting system falls short of facilitating this kind of data collection. It also triggered some conversations between principals and Padres, the community organization, who had begun publishing school-by-school discipline data in the annual accountability report. The primary question was and remains, how do we promote the collection of accurate data? And so, like I said, Denver is by no means perfect, but what you'll find in this section is what our dream is for data collection. We are seeing finally that schools are doing a better job of reporting their discipline data, and that Denver Public Schools is doing a better job as a whole of reporting discipline data. We still do have some issues with that data being accurate. We're also really struggling with figuring out ways that schools can, in an easy way, track the restorative data. So how many circles are happening in school, when are restorative interventions being used, how often are teachers using restorative dialogue. And so this is certainly a dream section, but we're starting to see a lot of our schools in Denver really come up with creative ways of how they can track some of this information. Our guide concludes with recommendations as far as some types of professional development and some tools for implementation that you might use. The goal is that this section of the guide, particularly the tools for implementation, will continue to expand on our website. And so I hope this overview has given you a better idea of the way that our guide is structured. So I want to give you some examples of how you can actually use this guide now that you have it in your hand. So I wanted to talk about it by what level of implementation that your school is at and then what role you play in your school community. So if you are somebody who is just beginning in restorative practices, I have gotten some feedback that people feel like sometimes this guide feels like way too much, this timeline is too much to take on. And so a couple of schools I've been working with have just been deciding to start small. So they've selected 1 or 2 of the benchmarks for implementation and have been focusing their school's attention in that area. For individual teachers, oftentimes their school is not yet on board with restorative practices implementation. And so these teachers have been using our implementation benchmarks and basically translating them to the classroom level instead of using them at a school level. And so some of these teachers have been working to, for example, go along with benchmark 6, they're working to engage students and families in the implementation of restorative practices within their own classroom. And then they're hoping that they can collect survey data from those parents and those students and then use that to advocate for why their school should implement at a school-wide level. If you're a community member, if you're a student or a parent or just somebody very involved in the education system in your community, I highly recommend using this as an advocacy tool. That is what it is meant for. And so you could use the benchmarks, for example, or the anti-model to provide language for what you want to see in your school and what you don't want to see in your school. Also on our website, which it will be on the last slide of this presentation, we've created some easy-to-use one-pagers for if you, for example, are going to sit down with your administrator, questions that you might ask them about restorative practices to better understand their level of implementation. There's also sheets such as a way that a parent might be able to analyze data if they're looking at school-wide discipline data. And so we definitely have some additional tools online that might be especially helpful for community members that are looking to use this for an advocacy tool. If you are in a boat that I think a lot of us find ourselves in, which is you've tried restorative practices and it's somewhat working, but it hasn't completely taken off, I think if you're in a school or you're a district leader, I think this could be an incredibly helpful troubleshooting tool. You could use the benchmarks and, again, the anti-model to identify where it is that you're experiencing challenges and then go back and follow the timeline for those benchmarks that you're really struggling around. If you're a teacher, again, you can use this as an advocacy tool. I would especially look to, like where are you missing the support that you feel like other people in your school building should be providing, so that establishing roles section could be really helpful. And also the types of professional development, like where have you maybe not been giving the tools that you need to be able to carry this out in your classroom. If you're a community member, again, I would assess your school based on the benchmarks. We have, like I said, a lot of one-pagers on our website, one of which is an assessment that kind of breaks down each benchmark, and it's a simple checklist that you would go in and then ask to sit down with your principal to review what you saw in that building. I also think this can be a really useful tool to advocate for why you as a community member should be more involved in your building. And so if you look at the stakeholder collaboration section of the guide, there are suggestions about how a parent or a student or a family member might be able to get more involved in their school and how you could ask to play a role in restorative practices implementation. And then finally, if you've been implementing restorative practices and you've generally been seeing success, I would say that you can use this to kind of celebrate the benchmarks you've already reached and expand upon the ones that you feel like you're ready to, that you've reached them and you want to exceed. You could use this tool to identify those areas that still can be refined and have a better understanding of how you might systemize restorative practices even further in your school. As a teacher, one thing that I have a teacher that I worked with at one of our Colorado Education Association summits that was saying she was going to use the guide to model what advanced data collection could look like from just at the classroom level. And so she was going to do the work to track, the restorative conversations she's having with students and try to develop a system that other teachers might be able to use. And then as a community member, I would say use this guide as an organizing tool. You can go out and engage other community stakeholders in this work to support your schools so that your implementation can become more advanced. So this guide could certainly be used if you go to sit down with law enforcement or judges or local universities to kind of build that network to make sure that your school's implementation is sustainable long term.
All right, so thank you so much, Allison. Allison has been I can't even describe what a blessing she's been with the partnership and really helping us get this guide produced, and so we're super excited to be able to share it with you. So I'm going to do something very brave now, and we're going to take you all off mute because we wanted to leave some time for question and answer. So we could do this a couple ways for those of you who are on the webinar. You could type in your questions and we can answer them. If not, we're going to unmute you. So we'll ask if you don't have a question that you, on your own end, you may mute yourself so we don't hear background noise as other people are asking their questions. And we'll try to, get to everyone's question in a timely fashion. So you should all be unmuted now. And so if anyone has a question, just state your name and then we can answer it.
Hi, this is Erica
Chavarria.
Hi. My question is in terms of training staff. One of the biggest pushbacks that I've heard and seen in my county has to do with the time it takes for the training. In order to do it, in order to make sure that the trainings are, maintaining the integrity and respect of what restorative should look like, and the fidelity of the trainings themselves. So, what are the suggestions to either have those conversations with central office or with the principals on, or any strategies on being able to figure out a way to get as many staff members trained as possible with the full amount of days and hours to be considered trained?
Okay, so we're going to take that question about training. As we take it, we're going to put everyone back on mute so we don't hear any background noise. So thanks for that question, Erica. So I'll start and then I'll have Allison jump in. So I think nationally that is a really big issue. That's one of the reasons why we started actually providing the trainings in partnership with NEA, because we were actually really concerned about what we were seeing across the country in terms of the fidelity of trainings. Very quick trainings. We had some places where people were being sat in front of a video for 2 hours and then told to keep a circle. We had discrepancies even within the district, so some people received a really good high-quality training and other people did not. And so I think we've tried really hard nationally to be able to create a model where folks can actually look to and say, okay, well, this is what it's supposed to look like. And I think a beauty of working with a teachers union is that we're able to have the teachers union actually endorse a training in a particular type of format. So like some of the things that we're going to do on our end are to kind of come up with like some principles. We have worked over the last year about really developing a set of principles so people can recognize a good training when it happens, so people can call it out. I think, you know, we did have some additional information, I think originally in the guide, that highlighted what like a good training could look like, or like highlighted some places that we're doing some quality trainings, but because we're never sure how long things are going to last, we decided like it would be best to take those out. But I know that I remember after sending this guide out to some folks, someone wrote back that, you know, they had been having an issue in their particular school district about getting teachers on board, right, and about kind of, you know, letting, you know, I guess getting not buy-in, but ownership of the work, and how useful it was to actually have a resource with the union's logo and name on it, because that would actually help them with advocacy efforts at the local level. And so for all of you who've gone through a training, I think, who kind of know the difference between like a high quality training and one that, you know, isn't so good, I think, you know, using your voice to be advocates, I know a lot of you have done that. And then I know Allison will probably talk about like one of the things we also stress is like the importance of planning and planning out, right? And so if this is something that you want to do, it may require some time to actually, you know, spend time actually planning what that's going to look like. Looking at a professional development calendar, not only just for the school, but for the school district, for those of you within a teachers union, their professional development days there, and really making the push to use those days to advocate for restorative justice. And so that may mean that you're having to do a lot of pre-work and do a lot of planning ahead, so you're not trying to do some of that in the middle of the school year when those calendars have already been set.
Yeah, so just echoing what Juana just said, one thing we've definitely learned is that principals typically set their professional development calendars, like oftentimes the spring before a school year has started. And so if you're like at this time of year trying to get into to professional development in a given school, like the odds are that's not going to happen. And so I think just the planning piece has been really useful, but then also understanding that like that level of intensity of training, you probably don't need to train all of your staff in that way from the very beginning. And so selecting some like key players in your school community that you think can really be the driving forces of this work to attend like a 4-day or a 2-day training, just to be able to like invest that time and energy in people that you know that are going to carry this work out. Another thing I also think a lot about with professional development is also just ensuring the fact that all of the professional development that you deliver to your staff, none of it should undermine any of the work you're trying to do with restorative practices. So one thing I have been doing with schools like around this time of year is take out your professional development calendar that I know you already have planned to the minute, and let's go through everything that you're doing and make sure that everything you're doing is connected to restorative practices and upholds that philosophy that you're trying to put in your school. Even when you're doing you know, professional development around like curriculum and instruction, like you should be adding a restorative lens to what you're doing there. And so there are ways to make sure that you're still instilling that philosophy and that culture with your staff, even though you might only be investing like in those like 2 or 4 or 5-day trainings in a certain number of key people.
Okay, so Erica, I hope that, you know, gave you a little bit of insight into some things that you can do. So we've unmuted everyone again in case there are any additional questions. Also, if folks, because I think this is also, okay, it looks like we do have have a question too, but I think also this is a really good time for sharing too. And so if there are folks who like have, come up against that challenge or that barrier and also want to respond, that is fine too. But we do have a question from Gina. My district is pushing me to move to restorative practices. Some school principals are already trying to implement it in their schools, but I'm not sure that they have been properly trained. Is there a specific training I can refer them to? And so we are still, for those of you who went to the 4-day, with either Cheryl, Aura, Pamela, Vanessa, Rita, Robert, we are still going to continue to offer those, hopefully. We're still just waiting on final word from NEA, and so they can always attend those. One of the things, though, that we also really want to spend this particular school year working on is to be doing a lot of follow-up trainings and a lot of follow-up support to folks who've already gone through the trainings. And so I think that, if you're in a school district where you're seeing a lot of interest and you want a specific training for you all, sending us an email. And so we can work on like having that conversation with NEA and possibly providing a follow-up training. We have done that in a lot of places that we've been working with individually over the last few years, provided a training specifically for that district. I also think that, I was going to say something else about you. As Allison mentioned, some of this work was funded, or this partnership is actually being funded through an NEA grant. So for some of you union members, I think also taking advantage of some of the grants that NEA has that can provide some funding for some training, some 4-day trainings within your school district. And so if you have a large group of folks who want to go through the training and you're not sure if you can send them away to the 4-day training, but you want someone to come out and you may want, need some funding to do that, then there are some grants that are available through the union to get that work done as well. All right, so any other questions? You're off mute again.
I have a question.
Thank you for watching.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is Julius Thomas from California.
Hi, Julius.
Hey, what's happening? And my question is, you said that you're going to try to offer the training for those of us that have already been trained. And we were talking about training the trainers, offering training so we could train the trainers and such.
Yep.
Do you know when those trainings might be offered? Like, might it be this upcoming year 17 or 18, or might be further pushed off in the future?
Okay. So so I know a lot of folks are really interested in becoming trainers, and so first one of the requirements to become a trainer is, we say either keep 100 circles or keeping circles consistently for about a year, because you'll get to about 100 circles if you're keeping them pretty consistently throughout a year. We are, and I know that have been some folks who are trained really early, who were trained prior to coming to one of these trainings, who have been doing that. And so one of the things that we are also in conversation with NEA about is developing a train-the-trainer model. We do have someone who is willing to do that. She is actually the person who brought restorative justice to Oakland Unified School District, so she has a lot of experience in this area, and she is really interested in providing that. So we do have a model that we are pitching. We just need funding for it. So that is something that we are hoping to roll out next year if we can get the funding for that. But then those basic requirements of keeping circles consistently for a year would still apply.
I have a question. I'm Katina from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Will they be providing training like in the local state, or you have to request it, or is it just in one central area such as Washington, where we had the previous?
Yeah, we will provide training at the local level, but that is a request that you have to make. So if you just send me an email, then we can make that request. Do you have any other questions?
I've got a question.
Okay.
This is Jenna in El Paso.
Hi, Jenna.
Hi. We have an empowerment workshop coming up, the Social Justice Task Force here, and it'll be April 28th, and I believe you'll be co-facilitating. We have been organizing also with NEA Las Cruces, and I'm trying to get Socorro local on board. EPTA is, of course, supporting it. My question is, a majority of our students and parents are more comfortable in Spanish than English, where we're going to have this. Is there any movement on getting the guide or other materials into Spanish, or will we need to do that ourselves between now and then?
I actually just got our Spanish translation of the guide this morning, and so I'm gonna have, I do not speak Spanish, so I'm going to have a native Spanish speaker look through it to make sure that it's ready to go, and we'll get it plugged into our design formatting, but we're hoping to have the implementation guide up in Spanish within the next week. And then those one-page tools that I referenced, we're hoping to have those translated as well. So I just sent those off to the translator to get an estimate. But yes, we want this to be as accessible as possible. And so we're beginning with Spanish, and maybe one day we'll be able to start translating to other languages as well.
That was a great question. Thanks, Jenna. Have any other questions?
If you don't find accommodations right now and you can wait, certainly give it another couple of hours, call throughout the day today, or also just continue to call a little bit further out in the surrounding areas.
Any other questions out there? Okay, so I had to put everyone on mute just briefly. So, yes, who's that?
Hi, Dwana. This is Netta from Glendale, California. How are you?
I'm fine, Netta. How are you?
Doing fantastic. I did type my question, but I think it might have gotten lost in the sea. So our group very, very enthusiastically presented before our Board of Education on Tuesday evening, and our board has indicated a solid commitment to not only support our efforts, they're very excited. We're piloting in 2 schools. The question I have for you is, aside from trainings, is there anything in terms of resources that you would recommend, whether it's printed materials, or is there anything that we can put out to, I guess, our larger stakeholder groups in the community that would raise awareness, some type of tool, whether it be an interactive one or a printed one, or cards, or something that would be your best bang for your buck, that would provide the most number of people with the basics of what they need to at least understand why we're moving forward with this, and to achieve that kind of collective base from which we can build on once we have our trainers trained and have better stakeholder involvement and support. What are your thoughts on that? Is there anything that you recommend that we could actually put in the hands of everyone?
Yeah, so some resources, so thank you for that question. So we developed some resources, especially for community members. We work with a number of community-based organizations who have been advocating for restorative justice in their school settings, and so a lot of them have actually produced reports. So I can send some of those out. Some of them just explain kind of what restorative justice is from the community lens. We have the same resources for educators, but I think that community part is important so they can understand what it is. We have even some stuff that just talks about the school to prison pipeline, but in like a comic book form for young people, so they can understand maybe what's happening in the school setting and why there may be a move towards restorative justice. I think some of the one-pagers that Allison referenced on the website, denverrp.org, they're also like some really great, just kind of simple tools that communities can use to advocate for things there. I think we also really developed the guide. I know it's not necessarily a quick read, but it is an easy read. But we did also design that in a way so it could be accessible to community organizations as well. I mean, because some of the things that we were hearing from some of the places that we work with was that, you know, their district is implementing restorative justice. They know that their district is not getting it right, but they also don't know what right looks like, right? And so they don't really know exactly, once they advocate for it and once they get the win, then how do they make sure that the district is actually doing it well? And so, you know, that's been really important to us. And so, you know, to piggyback on one of the questions from earlier, we are really also trying to think through like how we can know, like how we can call out what is working well, what's not working. I also think like kind of the myths and facts section of the implementation guide is really helpful.
Which does have its own one-pager.
Because it talks about like how what we think restorative justice is, and how we think it's supposed to do all these things, and the reality is that it's something different. And so I think there are lots of tools and resources out there. I can send a lot of those community-based resources to you, and I don't know if Padres has.
The one thing that actually comes to mind is Padres and Advancement Project produced a short YouTube video, probably like 5 or 6 years ago, and it actually is on the website that we keep referencing, which I can actually pull up for you guys. The next slide. A very long way.
Technology.
So that website that's at the bottom, if you go to the website, the video would just automatically start playing. But it's if you're just looking for a quick tool that people could reference, it is a video that kind of looks at like what is the school to prison pipeline, and then what kind of success have schools that have implemented restorative practices seen. So it can just be a really comprehensive like 8-minute video to show people.
So I hope that answered like some of your questions, Netta.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's really important that for those that are not aware of what restorative practices are, that they are not misinformed. I think the slower rollout, the accurate quality controlled rollout is more important than potentially losing people, you know, because of their perceptions of what RG is without understanding. And so that was where the question came from. Thank you, Dwana.
No problem. Are there any other questions?
Dwana, this is Anita from Baton Rouge.
Hi, Anita.
How are you? I think that's a great idea to send out the information about what restorative justice is and a clipping of it, because we're going to implement it this year through PBIS. So at first I said the teachers need to be, you know, kind of retrained as to know what it is before we can implement it with the students so they can buy into it. So thank you for sending out that information, you know, the video clipping as well as, you know, something hard copy on what restorative justice is.
Sure, no problem. And we do know, I mean, you know, we talk about this all the time, how that the importance of, you know, getting the adults trained and having that conversation with the adults really being the ones who kind of set the school climate in the building. And so if you only focus on the children, you won't really change the climate, right? And so it really has to be, when we talk about a whole school approach to implementation, that is what we mean, the involvement of everyone.
Right, right. Yeah.
Dwana, I have a question. This is Robin.
Hi, Robin.
Hi, Robin.
Hi. Hey. So here in Prince George's County, the board did pass to pilot restorative practices and to bring on a restorative practices coordinator. So that person has not come on yet, but there have been the charter schools, all of the charter schools in Prince George's County have sent people to some training in New York, and they went to that training for a couple of days, came back and trained all the imagined people in like 2 days. So what do you do in a situation like that? There was also another school who did the exact same thing. Half the school has not been properly trained, and they consider themselves to be doing restorative practices. So when the restorative practices coordinator comes on, what are some suggestions to be able to go against that has already been put in place? I mean, do you deal with? Go ahead.
No, it's a shame. Kevin Gilbert was on the line earlier, and I believe he had to get off. I think he's at a school board meeting. But you know, for those of you who don't know, Kevin is on the NEA's executive committee, and he recently took a position as the director of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Howard County Public Schools in Maryland. And you know, I think one of the first things that he did was, well, one of the things I think he's doing right now is assessing like what the school district is actually doing when they say that they are implementing restorative practices, right? And so if you're newly hired in a school district and there's been things going on, I mean, one of the things that we suggest is that you got to know what's been happening, right? Is there consistency throughout the district? Are there different offerings? Are people doing different things? For the folks that are doing something, is it quality what they're doing? And not being afraid to actually stop, right? If you recognize that that things aren't working out well, that things aren't going as you think that they should, not being afraid to actually to stop. I mean, we did a training earlier this month, and during the training, earlier this summer, and during the training, someone asked about just that, like being part of the training, they realized that their school district maybe wasn't doing things up to par, and you know, they asked, so you know, what do we do when we go back home? And the answer was, well, pause, right? It's okay to, I mean, just like, you know, the circle is a process, it's okay to say, you know, we've done some things, we want to right the ship, and so we're going to take a second to analyze what we're doing, to develop a plan on how we're going to roll this out correctly throughout the school district. And so that may mean retraining, that may mean, you know, like kind of highlighting schools or classrooms where it's working well, but there's nothing wrong. I mean, I think like for what some of the stuff that Allison was saying about being honest, about Denver being honest about, you know, how this work has actually, you know, taken place within the school communities, there's nothing wrong with saying, you know, we want to make sure we're doing this right, and so we're going to pause for a second to ensure that we actually have it right before we restart anything else. And so, you know, for school districts that have been doing this work and, you know, you recognize that, you know, there may be some challenges or, you know, it may be troubling a little bit, you know, just advocating for just saying, okay, well, so we're going to take a second and just kind of reevaluate what we're doing, what we've done, and then create a plan, a solid plan on how we're going to move forward.
I think also having that kind of mentality has been really helpful in getting schools to accurately report their data. We've seen that a lot in Denver, where schools stopped reporting their suspension and expulsion data accurately when they felt like they were being shamed for their suspension and expulsion data, but when the district kind of started, the district and the community organization as well, instead started offering support for schools that accurately reported concerning discipline data, it really shifted in the district that now schools are willing to like actually seek the help that they need. So I think that mentality can also just help with the, you know, the overall movement and push of an entire district.
Did that answer your question, Robin?
Yes, it did, and I just have to think positive because of where I am and the nature of our climate, and so I just have to just think positive in reference to what you just said, because it's a different monster down here.
We can have some conversations offline too about, like, you know, if you're still running into challenges even with that idea, like, you know, some of the ways you may be able to kind of leverage some of the resources out there that already exist.
Okay.
Okay, so Vanessa sent me a text message, and so which I'm assuming is a question she would answer for. So Vanessa, who is a restorative justice trainer out of Chicago, but also part of the Chicago Police Department, had a question about like including law enforcement in the process. And so I don't know, Allison, if you want to talk, I don't know if law enforcement is included in the process in Denver, and if not, Vanessa, it actually really would be good for you to kind of talk about some of the work that you're doing in Chicago. since we're talking about kind of like broad stakeholder engagement and inclusion, like how you're kind of rolling that out in Chicago, especially since we now have gotten to a place where law enforcement have become a big part of the school community as well.
So in Denver, what we're seeing is, so in Denver public schools, every high school has a school resource officer. And so like I said, implementation depends very much from school to school in Denver, but the schools that I've seen be the most successful typically also train their resource officers in restorative practices. And then the only other thing I wanted to add is that Padres, the community organization, has been doing some work with the Denver Police Department to hold community forums where police officers sit down with youth and have conversations about like how you feel about police. And there's been trainings for the police as well to better de-escalate situations that happen with young people. But that's the extent of my knowledge of what's happening in Denver.
Vanessa, did you want to add? You're muted right now, so I think I don't know if you're on mute, like, purposely. You're off.
Okay.
Okay, there you are.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know how to do this thing. Okay. So thank you for entertaining my question. And I bring that up because when we talk about the school-to-prison pipeline, the pipeline also has a touch point and a gateway from the police department. And what happens is that once it's initiated, we initiate that process, right? So there's this void or this vacuum that sometimes gets overlooked and be very instrumental in shifting the culture and shifting the trajectory of how young people are placed in systems. We're currently, I've got the green light from our superintendent to rethink and train our officers in the kaleidoscope of things. In Chicago, we have school response team. We don't have school resource officers, which is a big difference. Not so different because the culture of law enforcement pretty much across the country. But I would ask that as you're establishing this phenomenal space within your schools, that you don't exclude law enforcement, especially if they are assigned to be in your school. Tawana and NEA and everyone have really looked at this as a team effort. If everybody is creating a whole school climate, it is inclusive of your law enforcement presence, be it a response team or officers that are assigned to your schools, that they be in that growth. Because, again, the pipeline or the initiation, it starts with one arrest, right? We know about all the things that happen to lead that arrest, and some people think when it gets to the place that it's arrested, there's no turning around, that's just the way that it is, but I beg to differ. It can change. You can stop it right there. They don't have to be arrested if there are restorative options, and that's what we're working on here in Chicago. We're looking at what could restorative law enforcement strategies really look like, from really implementing effective diversion processes to really what does that look like as an encounter on the street. So think about, your entire school, including your security personnel and your law enforcement presence, and include them in the development some kind of way. Have them sitting in your circles with your teachers. It's just often that's a button that's pushed in panic, but it could also be pushed to, to create a different restorative climate in your schools.
Yeah, thank you for that, Vanessa. I think that's really important. And for those of you, like I said, Vanessa is a practitioner, a trainer, a law enforcement officer. And for those of you, and so she does some of the trainings for us as well, and did some in Maryland over the summer. And that collaborative approach, that team approach, and including law enforcement in the same trainings that educators are getting. So if you are trying to have a restorative school, but you haven't talked to the police about how you don't want them to arrest the children, then that's an issue, right? And so the importance of, having police officers, if you have them, sit in some of those spaces along with educators so everyone's hearing the same information at the same time. And if you're in a space where you may want to do something specifically for law enforcement officers or SROs, Vanessa is a really great trainer who can do that work.
Tawana.
Yes.
This is Pauline in Alabama.
Hi, Pauline. How are you?
Question about coming on board with my restorative justice training as a community person. I am working with the sheriff department here, and I'm working with the city council and our mayor on ways to decrease excessively high numbers of discipline problems in our school system. Currently, the school system is under intervention by the State Department of Education. And now I want to go in and work with them to show them that there's some other avenues as to how to reduce the number of suspensions or exclude, when the kids are taken out of the main environment and put someplace else, in-house suspension, there's no learning going on during that time.
Right.
So I need some suggestions on how I can get them on board with how we think, how restorative justice can be a solution to them in the school system. And they're thinking about bringing in charter schools here.
Okay. So yeah, so we do have some resources on the harms of exclusionary discipline and how suspensions, expulsions lead to higher dropout rates, decreased graduation rates, and incarceration rates. And we also have data, we have data from Denver as well that shows how by implementing restorative justice practices, you can actually increase graduation rates, you can increase attendance rates, and you can decrease the dropout rates. In Denver, they've actually seen an increase in graduation rates, an increase in all the good things as their enrollment has actually increased, right? And so that's also something that you usually don't see. So they're getting more children going to the schools, but they're having a decrease in suspension, expulsion, school-based arrest, and an increase in graduation and attendance rates. And there are a lot of places out there, a number of places out there where we have the data that shows both the harmful correlation between push out and incarceration, and then what and how restorative justice can actually help address some of those issues. And so, we can send those out to you. We have some reports. There's just some, school district data that we have. We have just information just on the harms of kind of zero tolerance and exclusionary discipline policies. And so we can make, a lot of that stuff is on our website. And so we can make that stuff available to you all as well. So you can have the tools that you need to make that case. We also can do peer-to-peer sharing. And so if you are working with a superintendent or a school board or a judge or, a sheriff in your community and you want to, rely on, someone else from another community who kind of, feels the same way you do, we can connect a judge from, Georgia who has basically told people he does not want to see any more school cases in his courtroom. And what that did was that forced the school district to change its policies. We can put you in touch with police officers. Like in Denver, they came to that agreement because the police were actually just tired of arresting children, especially for things that they felt could be handled in a school building. And so we could put you in touch with a police officer in another place. We can put you in touch with a school principal who's made the decision that, we are going to implement restorative justice here in this school, and if that means that we're going to lose some staff along the way, we're going to be clear about what we're going to do anyway because, they're really committed to it. We can put superintendent, school board members the same. And so, if you have a specific request about, someone whose mind you're trying to change and you may, you're running into, some stumbling blocks, then sometimes that peer-to-peer sharing actually really helps.
Oh, good. Our new CEO is preparing a list of new professional development activities and different workshops for the teachers. So I think this will be an avenue for us to get this in at this time.
Yep. That's great, Pauline.
I want to keep in touch with you because I want to move forward. We have a school board meeting next Tuesday night, and I asked to be placed on the agenda to speak to this.
Okay, that's great.
Thank you for the support, and I've enjoyed this webinar.
Oh, thank you, Pauline. So I think we have time for like one more question, and then Allison wants to, is going to give us a little bit more information about some of the opportunities that are available through the partnership.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Georgine Fountain.
Hi, Georgine.
Yeah, Michael, hi, how are you doing? My question is about morale building. So we have people in my district who have been trained by the local union to use restorative justice, and we're planning to update their skills this year. But a lot of us are singletons in our schools, not a part of the district pilot program. So how often would you recommend that we have like celebration get-togethers or reunions or something just to keep our morale up? So if you're in the building and you're the only one there and you're doing a lot of work trying to get whole school implementation, so what do you suggest on how to do that?
Yeah, so I think that's really important, especially if you're the only person in the school. And I think one of the things that we're really trying to get better at, we're going to be better next year, y'all. We're really trying to, so there are a lot of you all out there, right? And there are a lot of you out there who are in the same space. You may not be in the same school, but you're in the same school district, and you may not know each other. Maybe you're in the state. So one of the things that we're going to work on throughout this year is really trying to make sure that we are doing a better job of gathering folks together. One of the things that we've been really trying to do all year is to have kind of like a larger convening where we bring all the folks who've been trained together just for spaces to be able to kind of talk about what folks have been doing when they've gotten home, what some of the things that they have, that they can celebrate, some of the ideas that they have that they can share with other people, to talk about some of the challenges that they may be facing, but also creating the space to actually work through some of those challenges, to help folks kind of create like implementation plans for their school or district. And so we're still really trying, we are really like passionate about wanting to do this, and so we're still trying to do it. But one of the things that we actually are going to do better at this particular school year is kind of having some of those at least smaller gatherings. And so going into your communities and being able to like kind of get folks together who are of the like mind, who are trying to do this work. So you can actually be around folks who are in a similar situation of yours. Last year, we did monthly conference calls where we joined together on the telephone to kind of talk through some of those things. A lot of you were on those calls, but we do want to kind of take it a step further this school year and do some face-to-face meeting and exchanges as well. I don't know if you want to add anything about Denver morale, how important that is.
No, I think doing this work has always been a challenge on morale, and it can be exhausting. As far as at the school level, I've seen some schools have a lot of success in like systematizing celebrations, because the reality is that those are often the things that get left behind when like the work of the school year picks up. And so I've seen some schools that are able to like highlight success stories that they've seen with students, and sometimes that like, once a week they highlight a student success story that they have, or a staff member that's been doing some great work. Yeah, otherwise I would say, yes, we definitely need to be taking steps to improve morale for our staff.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Georgine. So Allison's going to give us some closing remarks. Tell us about some of the other offerings of the partnership, which, I think are really great and we're really excited about. And then also read a closing.
So as you guys take this guide, hopefully, back to your districts and your schools and your communities and put it to use, I do hope that you feel free to reach out to me. Like I said, if you have any questions with the guide, I just guarantee there are other people that have the same question, and so it would be great to just hear what some of the questions people have as they work through this guide. But also, like I said, we've been creating these one-page tools that kind of like supplement the guide and also make it a little bit more accessible. So your question might lead to the development of one of those tools in the future. So please, by all means, feel free to reach out via email so we can make sure that this guide is as useful as possible to the people we want using it. And then finally, in addition to this guide, our partnership offers another invaluable resource, which is the chance to see what school-wide restorative practices looks like in action. So we started this last school year, and throughout the 2016-2017 school year, our 3 demonstration sites generously opened their doors to over 150 visitors. Some came from Denver, some came from across the state of Colorado, and then we even had some nationwide visitors. And this year we are hoping to expand the number of national visitors so we can continue to grow this next network of like-minded educators and community members that are working to learn from one another. So if you go to www.denverrp.org and you select Take a Tour, you'll see the 3 different demonstration sites that we use. Each one of them is kind of at a different stage of implementation, and so you can read a little bit more about those schools. And then if you select Schedule a Tour, you'll be able to fill out the registration form and then let me know which school and which date you would want to come to Denver. And I know that Dwana and NEA is looking to maybe host some of those visits so we can bring some national educators together. So I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking to NEA tomorrow actually about an idea of actually being the host for some of those visits. And so, we're going to look at our calendars and see, what dates work for us. And then we will actually let you know of those dates, and then you can choose. I mean, there are a range of dates, and you can certainly go to any of them, but we wanted to also kind of have some where you can be with some of the folks you either were trained with or some of the folks who went through a similar training, or, just be around us again, right, because you miss us so much. So we will, once we identify what some of those dates are, we will send those out to you, and there is hopefully, I think we do have some, we also do have some funding available, and so if you are unable to kind of pay for those visits on your own, we do have some scholarships available for folks, and this is really important. I mean, one of the reasons that we, really wanted to start a visitation program is because people were asking us, well, what does it look like? Like, what does it feel like? How do I know I'm even in a school that is implementing restorative justice at all, right? And there is a difference, and you can see, just from the setup of the rooms, right? Some of the, boards on the wall, there is a feeling, there is a spirit, and, you get to spend time with staff and young people and do classroom visits and get to spend time with the principal and Allison and school district staff. And so you really do get a full picture of what it takes and what it looks like in the school. And so, go online and look at the visits, and then hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we'll be able to also send out a list of visits that, we'll be hosting along with Allison.
Great. So I'm going to close us out with a reading from Howard Zinn's A Government Cannot Suppress. We don't have to engage in grand heroic actions to participate in the process of change. Small acts, when multiplied by millions of people, can quietly become a power no government can suppress, a power that can transform the world. And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory.
So thank you all for joining. Thank you so much, Allison, for the wonderful information. Please reach out if you have questions or if you have needs. We really want to be supportive to you all in this work. Thank you so much for, giving your time this evening. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. This is
Bye-bye.
great.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Yes. No.